Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. President Trump has revoked a policy that required the CIA to account for civilian deaths from drone strikes outside of war zones. Human rights groups say this is an unnecessary and dangerous step backwards on transparency and accountability for lethal force and the civilian deaths they cause. Long-standing concerns about the legal implications of drone warfare and their efficacy in actually defeating terrorism remain. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Rahimullah Yusufzai, who is a political analyst, and he's joining us now from Peshawar. We're also joined by Mr. Christopher Kline, who is an independent journalist. He's formerly worked at CNN International and FNC, and he's been a war reporter as well. He's joining us now from Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Thank you both for joining us. Christopher, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of Trump's decision? What does this mean for accountability and transparency?
Well, I think the immediate answer would be is that it becomes all the more opaque. As you alluded to in your introduction, there have been numerous independent studies, research such as Columbia University, that while the figures and the complete balance of genuine militants, terrorists and other extremists killed in drone warfare vis-a-vis the civilian casualty count that usually such strikes, there is a massive discrepancy. Precise figures are difficult to come by, but one study from about 5-6 years ago concluded that as many as 98% of the fatalities and casualties in UAV attacks are civilians rather than the intended targets. And this will only add more mud to the water and make it more unclear and provide less evidence to actually consider this under the context of international law and indeed the Geneva Conventions.
Mr. Yusufzai, what are your thoughts on that? Because certainly the argument can be made that drones can target whoever they are seemingly targeting, but then the collateral damage is an important issue here, isn't it?
You know, I thought the whole U.S. system was about checks and balances, about democracy, about accountability, about protecting the rights of individuals. But these steps actually go back. You know, these are very regressive because, you know, you're giving a free hand. You're encouraging the people who order the drone strikes to do whatever they can, you know, outside the war zone or wherever. And, you know, there will be no accountability. There will be less, you know, transparency. And, you know, in fact, countries like Pakistan, Yemen, which are the most droned nations, also Afghanistan in the world, they will be really concerned. Although in Pakistan, the number of drone strikes have dramatically gone down, but they have increased in Afghanistan and also in Yemen and some other countries. So I believe that, you know, there has been no real proper, long and sustained study of the victims of drone strikes. I remember the Bureau of Investigative Journalism based in London. They started a study. The people who had been killed, were they really militants? Were they at the wrong place at the wrong time? Were they relations of the wanted militants? Or they were civilians? And I know many drone strikes in my country, in Pakistan, in the tribal areas, where a number of civilians were killed.
And Mr. Yusufzai, I wanted to pick up on that point that you just made. Christopher, it's interesting. It does seem like, doesn't it, that we're in this robotic AI version of war now, where everything is at a distance. Somebody sitting somewhere in the U.S. can fire from a drone flying over, be it Somalia or wherever nowadays. So those drones are flying over. There is that disconnect, isn't there, with the realization that there are humans that are being killed at the other end?
Well, that is a very apt question because it also poses two other fields of inquiry. One is the increased automation in warfare also poses many moral questions about the conduct of warfare, as there are also new weapon systems that are fully automated and remotely controlled that are capable of lethal strikes. And what does that do to the moral structures of conducting warfare? But another dimension that I would like to go into is that there is no question that to a very large degree, UAV warfare has degraded to a large extent many of the command structures of groups such as Daesh and the Taliban and Al-Qaeda franchises. But at what cost in terms of the collateral damage that you mentioned, which, by the way, is one of the most horrid euphemisms ever devised, intended precisely to dehumanize the human cost of those associated casualties. And one has to ask, if indeed it is a legitimate thing to carry out direct action, violent reprisals against violent extremists, which I don't disagree with when I have lost not a few friends of my own, all of them civilians, to such violent extremists, and even been targeted myself by them in the past. Nonetheless, if you kill 100 civilians for every extremist that you eliminate, have you not created more ground for greater radicalization? And then you have to consider cold-bloodedly, is this strategy even effective?
And that's a very good question, which I want to put to Mr. Yusufzai. In fact, Mr. Yusufzai, do you believe that this strategy is effective? Because as Christopher there said, and you know, many people would go a couple of steps even further, Mr. Yusufzai, they would say the drones are the most accurate weapons that we have at this point in time, that they, you know, the U.S. at least, many U.S. officials would argue that it doesn't get better than this when it comes to accuracy, and that many extremists and terrorists have been killed through this successfully. What do you make of that?
You know, we can say that yes, at present they are the most accurate. We can say yes, drones have killed very important people, targets which were located in very difficult terrain, where the armies could not reach, where the air strikes were not effective, but you know, drones were very effective. We know many important people who were killed by drones, you know, even in Pakistan and also in Afghanistan. You know, the TTP leaders, the top command, you know, Baitullah Masood, Hakimullah Masood, Qari Hussain, Mullah Nazir, all these guys, you know, were killed by drones, American drones. So that's true, you know, but again, I will say, at what cost? You know, there have been so many civilian casualties. I know of a grandmother who was picking vegetables in her farm, you know, in a village near Miransha in North Waziristan. She was killed along with some of her, you know, grandchildren and children. I know about a jirga. Jirga means a council.
Yes.
It was meeting on the banks of a stream in Datta Khel in North Waziristan, and they were trying to settle a local dispute about the ownership of the chromite mine, collectively owned in the nearby mountains. And this jirga was attacked. Maybe this was wrong intelligence. They thought these are militants gathering there for a meeting. But they were all civilians, and 50 of them were killed. Imagine, 50 people killed in one strike. There are so many other cases. You know, a madrasa, an Islamic school was bombed in Damadola in Bajor in 2005. 83 people were killed, mostly young children, studying in the madrasa, along with their 3 teachers. You know, and this actually was the turning point, I must say, in the war against terrorism in Pakistan, because just about a month or 40 days, the militants struck back and they attacked Pakistan Army's training center for soldiers in Dargai, and they, you know, about 42 then soldiers were martyred.
Okay, so let me pick up on that point you just made there, Mr. Yusufzai. You know, we know that under President Obama was when drones were used the most by the U.S. government around the world, and of course even in Pakistan. Do you think that this argument that I put to Christopher from a former Obama official about trying to give what they call precise information to counter any narratives by anybody else that, in fact, civilians are being killed. What do you make of that argument? Do you think it's valid?
You know, it was self-believing. They thought they are doing a very good job and they're very accurate. And, you know, I think many of their officials even said there has been no single civilian casualties. But they were challenged. They never really tried to correct themselves because, you know, people in government do that. They believe that they can do no wrong. And they make all these claims. I think there are figures available which would show that they were wrong. There were civilian casualties. And let me also make another point.
Sure.
You know, I know from my own experience, the militants actually had been focusing on the families which lost members in drone attacks. They have been going to these families in the past and telling them that, you know, we can help you take revenge. And these people were radicalized. Some of them became suicide bombers. Some of them started fighting the Americans in Afghanistan. Some of them started fighting the Pakistani state. So, you know, these kind of things happen. But if you want to know these things, you can know them. If you want to close your eyes, then you will be right in saying that, no, we are doing a good job.
Let me go to Christopher, if I may, just for a moment. Christopher, if you can hear me, just tell me what you think about the fact that do drone strikes, in fact, create more terrorists? Does that actually aggravate the problem which, this entire program is meant to be fighting against?
Well, I'm going to take a slightly different tack, and I'm sorry because of technical difficulties.
Sure.
I lost you
no
earlier.
Problem. Yep.
But as a lifelong student of warfare, what I want to first convey is that counterinsurgency, counter-guerrilla warfare, and counter-terrorism, as opposed to conventional warfare, is the most labor-intensive, the most demanding, the most complex, and the most difficult form of warfare that exists, because it doesn't simply take place on the battlefield. And in the end, one of the problems that I have with UAV warfare is that it seems to reduce everything down to a simple equation and of push-button warfare at a removed from the human consequences, good and bad, of those actions. And there is a myth behind the idea of these precision strikes, and even for that matter, precision pinpoint bombing. Anyone that has been on a battlefield knows that war is very messy and imprecise. And I'm even remembering myself from some of the time that I spent in the field with U.S. Special Operations troops, and in particular what's called a forward air controller, or a JTAC, a Joint Terminal Attack Controller, a specialist commando from the Air Force that is on the ground directing airstrikes, and how often those airstrikes go wrong, even when you have the most competent JTACs in the world. I myself once was in Iraq when a U.S. airstrike took out U.S. Kurdish allies and even allied special forces in a completely mistaken airstrike on a road that I had been on many times before myself, and I counted myself fortunate that I wasn't there. Now, to get back to the context of unconventional warfare and counterterrorism, above all, before you launch a direct action mission and execute lethal violence, your antagonist, on your target, this above all depends on painstaking intelligence gathering, and above all, painstaking human intelligence gathering. And there has been too much dependence on technological intelligence gathering rather than eyeballs on the ground. And even though it often causes casualties, you can't get away from the fact that the most effective way to take out a terrorist, extremist, antagonist combatant is with other men and women on the ground with guns who have direct and accurate intelligence of their target, and they confront them face to face. You can't do it all at a distance by remote control.
Let me pick up on that.
One other point historically.
If you allow me, Christopher, I want to pick up on that point you just made there and put that to Mr. Yusufzai. Mr. Yusufzai, what then are the alternatives in this war against terrorism? Is it to continue to fight this in this fashion that has been fought in so far, or what alternatives do you think would be more successful in fighting this?
I don't think this will be given up. It's an advantage which the U.S. and maybe some other countries have. They will like to continue use it. They think it's very effective. I think what we need to know is that there should be acknowledgement if there are civilian casualties earlier or in future. They should seek forgiveness from the people who were killed if they are innocent. I remember President Obama had apologized when an American was killed in a drone strike, in North Waziristan. He was kidnapped by the militants, and that place was attacked. And two Western people were killed, one from Italy, one from the U.S. So I think, if you can apologize, if your own countryman has been killed, you can also apologize if somebody from another country has been wrongly killed, because these are, simply extrajudicial killings. You are killing people without trying them, without, getting them convicted. So you are actually killing people. And in the end, initially, okay, they were targeting high-profile people, wanted people, but in the end, they had no targets. So they were going after the foot soldiers, common people, who may have been radicalized, who may have picked the gun for some other reasons, for local reasons. They were also killed. So I think that, you are spending so much money. You have the technology. It's a very, effective weapon if properly used, honestly used, and transparently used.
Christopher, I wonder, about the attitude about those on the decision-making side, if I may. And I'm going to pick on the U.S. for a moment, Christopher, if you allow me, because leaked documents, and these were reported on by The Intercept, as you may know, and I'm sure you do well know about this, about how the U.S. refers to many of the casualties in drone strikes as, quote, enemies killed in action, end quote, because they were males of military age. And even in 2012, Obama's administration had said that, you can carry out strikes even against people in places like Yemen, Pakistan, without even needing to know the exact identities of those people being targeted. That shows sort of a very disturbing attitude, doesn't it, Christopher, on the end of those who are making the decisions here?
It is very problematic. It is absolutely disturbing, and it reminds me of a proverb from the Vietnam War, where there was also an issue with the deaths of many Vietnamese civilians in combat action against the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. And the rather macabre proverb that emerged was, if it's dead and Vietnamese, it's Viet Cong. And there is a similar parallel, ugly echo to that. But I want to take a completely different tack and go in another direction, where when I mentioned earlier that successful counterinsurgency, and there have been very few successful counterinsurgencies in history, requires not only military action. And the endless war in Afghanistan now is entering a different phase where tremendous greater bloodletting on the battlefield and astronomical casualties, not only for the Afghan National Army, but very high casualties for Afghan civilians, coincides with a negotiation process. And we have to consider these different facets of how we resolve this long-running insurgency and counterterrorism question. And then if we revert to Pakistan, where the Pakistani armed forces themselves have seen hard combat action in the tribal territories and have themselves also come under scrutiny for their own human rights abuses and atrocities in certain instances. And then we have to consider the innocent civilians in places like North Waziristan and throughout the tribal territories that are fearful all at once of NATO drones, their own military, and the militants that they may not themselves be partisan to. And so what is the solution itself for Pakistan for bringing peace to the tribal territories? That question does not lie with the gun. I would argue that that same question is also applicable across the Durand Line in Afghanistan. That question can be best resolved with political negotiation and socio-economic development. What do the tribal territories need? They need better infrastructure. They need to be less marginalized economically, societally, and they need to be more accountable in a democratic process and to be heard better in a democratic process.
And I'm glad you brought that point up, Christopher.
A lot of the raison d'etre for the militants.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that point up, Christopher, because the point I wanted to, in fact, bring to Mr. Yusufzai. Mr. Yusufzai, should there be other solutions that should be brought forth? As Christopher laid out there, some of that, obviously, we may disagree with, but at the very least, there is no argument, is there, Mr. Yusufzai, that this does need to be, this issue of terrorism needs to be fought at different levels too, doesn't it? Where many of those people who have been brainwashed or otherwise, whatever term we may use, need to also be, taught or retaught ideologically about Islam, for example, from religious scholars, or otherwise on the ground, face-to-face, human-to-human, people-to-people. Those sorts of connections and otherwise are also important, isn't it?
Yes, I will agree. Yes, that's very important. I think, military solutions of these kind of issues are rare. There are very few cases in which a complete military victory has been obtained. There have been political solution negotiations, and I'm happy that finally the U.S. is negotiating with Taliban. Pakistan also, negotiated the army and the politicians. There were about 14 peace agreements signed in Pakistan. Some of them worked for a while, some didn't. So an effort was made, to resolve the issues peacefully. I think that what we need to do now is that we should keep trying, because, not all these, militants are there because they wanted to be there. They were forced by circumstances. Many of them want to return, but they don't think that they will be forgiven. There has to be an amnesty policy. A policy of amnesty is required, and that has been discussed, by the way, by the Pakistan government and the army chief. They are thinking of, finalizing an amnesty policy for the foot soldiers, for the common fighters, not the commanders, the ringleaders. So if that, is finalized, it will be controversial, I agree. Many people will not, support this.
Indeed.
But you cannot kill each one of the militant. And then, they have their families who are not really involved. So they also should be thought over. I think, you need to find new ways, innovative ways, more peaceful ways to resolve the issues.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final thought. The clock has got of us, but of course we appreciate both of your time and of course your analysis and insight as well that you brought to discussion. We were joined there by Mr. Rahimullah Yusufzai, political analyst, who's speaking to us from Peshawar, and we were also joined by Mr. Christopher Kline. He's an independent journalist. He formerly worked for CNN International and FNC as a foreign correspondent, as a war reporter. He was speaking to us from Lithuania's capital, Vilnius. Viewers, as our guest there spoke about, there are a number of facets to this issue of drone warfare. There is that, of course, of desensitization, lack of accountability, lack of transparency in this process, and also then the attitude of those who are in the decision-making position as well. And then there's the whole argument, is this even all really effective? Does it actually hurt the war on terror more than it helps it? And that, of course, argument then goes to the ideological war that needs to be waged to bring these people back into the fold of really understanding what it is that they're fighting for versus what they're not. We'll keep a very close eye, of course, on what Donald Trump's decision means going forward, what will happen going forward with the continuing drone warfare as used by the US and other Western countries around the world. I'll be back, though, after a short break with our next segment. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us here in Scope, viewers. The Modi government finds itself under the world's microscope. With Pakistan's keenness to de-escalate tensions despite India's provocations, eyes are turning to other sore points. Worries about the kind of society Modi and the BJP have brought to the fore are being expressed. The UN Human Rights Chief has warned of discrimination and targeting of Dalits, Muslims and others in today's India. To discuss that a bit further, we're joined firstly by Mr. Majid Mehmood, who is a research associate at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. Majid, as always, thanks for joining us here in Scope. Majid, what do you make of the de-escalation that has occurred at this point in time? Credit, obviously, I imagine, should go to the Pakistani government.
Yes, actually, Pakistan, if you see from the crisis in February 14th, when the Pulwama crisis happened, the tone of Pakistan in response to Indian provocation has been more of defensive and an objective of to create an environment of de-escalation. And Pakistan has been offering joint investigations to India, and Pakistan has been offering to have a dialogue on Kashmir issues despite, Indian brutalities and Indian hostility towards Pakistan. And it has also been offering to jointly fight against terrorism and extremism in the region. So in this context, you are right in assessing that Pakistan's overall objective throughout this crisis has been to de-escalate despite, Indian provocation and hostilities.
Majid, what do you make then of the internal issues within India, just not beyond, its foreign policy misadventures, such as its incursion over the line of control, but now also, hate crimes going against minorities of all sorts within that country? What do you make of that, Majid?
There is a particular mindset that has been developing within India since last decade or so, and it has culminated in the emergence of BJP in 2013 as an electoral when it gained an electoral victory in India. And this mindset is the mindset of Hindu nationalism, Hindutva, to be more precise. And within this philosophy spreading within the Indian society, they consider all those castes, other religious minorities, which forms Muslims and Christians, and within the lower stratas of Hindu, in terms of economy, the Dalits, or previously they were known as untouchables. So there is a particular brand of Hindu cultural nationalism that has gripped India within. So and this is this mob violence, or this internal communal violence that have many expressions, be it against the religious minorities or the Dalits. That has been well documented by the United Nations, and it has been consistent in its last couple of years reports that the violence against and the communal violence within India does poses a grave threat to India from within.
Okay, so let's try to go once again to Huma Baqai, who is joining us once again. Dr. Baqai is, of course, an international relations expert, and she's joining us from Karachi. Dr. Baqai, if you can hear me clearly now, I wanted to get your thoughts about, as I put to Majid there as well, and as you were answering earlier, about India not only dividing its own house, but also then picking a fight with its own neighbor.
Well, the dialogue between India and Pakistan has been stalled since the Modi government took over, and there was almost an unsaid understanding, at least in the Pakistan Foreign Office, that no dialogue or progress on peace initiatives can happen under the Modi regime because of his belligerent attitude and the way he continues to use Pakistan bashing and treating the Muslims and the minorities the way he does. But what has escalated in the last 3 weeks in near past, and subsequently before that, is also how the whole region is now hostage to Indian belligerence. The peace in this region is hostage, economic progress is hostage, the peace initiative in Afghanistan is hostage. But more importantly, I think India needs to look inwards and see what it is doing to its own society, because India has never been so divisive. This time when the Muslim Kashmiris protested against atrocities in Kashmir, it was the Sikh community that stood by them. It was the Sikh who came out and protected the Muslims in India against the atrocities of the state.
Yeah.
This should be a huge source of concern for a country that portrays itself as the custodian of secularism, as as the second largest democracy, and who also takes pride in its constitutionalism. So I think we should perhaps speak to the Indian civil society and the Indian people, because I think the elections that are coming are going in 45 days are going to be extremely critical. India has gone through is going to go through the second most critical elections in its nation history. The first was the 70s elections. This is when India decided post Indira Gandhi's attempt at emergency that, well, India remain a democracy or not. And then India won and a leader lost. This time again, the Indians have to decide, the Indian civil society, the Indian students, the Indian diaspora, the Indian people need to decide that what kind of India are they looking at, because lawmakers in India are saying that it is India that is at stake. It's pluralism, it's diversity, it's secularism, it's constitutionalism. Everything that India stands for today is challenged by Modi and he has not mincing words about it. He actually comes out and says that if he comes into power, he will make every single attempt to change the Indian constitution, which will be tilted towards the Hindutva, which essentially means that it will not just impact and harm, I'm using the word harm, the interest of the minorities in India, but also of the Hindu lower castes. And that is something India should worry about. And Kashmir is indigenous. The earlier India realizes that, because all of that happening, the root cause is Kashmir. It is that festering wound that India needs to address. Brushing it under the carpet or playing the blame game is not working anymore.
So, Dr. Baqai, I wonder then, with this hate crimes going, I've seen a number of reports, which I'm sure you're well aware of as well. One by Amnesty International's India chapter, talking about even, assaults, rapes, murders against various marginalized groups, such as you mentioned there, alluded to, in fact, the lower caste Dalits and even Muslims. And then we've seen over the past year or so, Dr. Baqai, cow vigilante justice, people being killed simply for transporting cows, for being accused of eating beef, etc. What does that say to you then about, as you correctly pointed out, the world's second largest democracy? What direction is this country going in? What does that mean for even the region as a whole as well?
But it scares me. It scares me because if India once again decides to give the reins of this absolutely vibrant country into the hands of someone that is going to drive it down the path of extremism, radicalization, divisiveness, and will compromise on everything India stands for. So I think a major concern should come out from within India. It is important that the Amnesty International or the United Nations or the European Union or the OIC is now pointing fingers or identifying issues that Pakistan has been talking about for several years now. The recognition and acknowledgement is extremely important. But at the end of the day, India still is the second largest democracy in the world. It is the people in India that must decide what direction the state is going to take. And I think also the BJP, also the Hindutva, the people who emerged as the representatives of such a huge party should actually decide that should they confine themselves to what Modi sees as to be best for India or what is really best for India. So I think the change should come from within, and it will come from within, and that is why these elections are so critical. And it is the state elections that Modi lost 3 months ago that has led to this frustration and this aggression and this belligerence and this something which is actually pushing this region towards war by blunder.
Very well, Dr. Baqai, we'll leave it there at that with you. I know that you have a busy schedule ahead, so appreciate your insight, analysis, and time. We're going to ask Majid to, stay with us. We're just going to go into a very short break, though, viewers. So we'll be back after that with the rest of this discussion on this topic. Stay with us. Thank you for staying with us here in the Scope, viewers. We're still with Mr. Majid Mehmood, Research Associate at Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. We're also now joined by Ms. Kavita Krishnan, human rights activist, joining us from Delhi. Kavita, thanks for joining us. Kavita, how much does the UN Human Rights Chief's statement about India worry you? What does it say about Indian society going forward, do you think?
It's extremely worrying. And we have an election a couple of months from now. And I think the challenge for us in India right now is, can we ensure that this government that we've had for the past 5 years goes? Because it's a government that has launched an all-out attack on India's constitution, on Indian minorities, especially Muslim minorities, but also Dalits, also Christians, Christian minorities, and also women, so Kashmiri people. So the situation is extremely dire. And I want to point out that these are not just incidents of violence which are just happening sporadically. They are orchestrated by and fanned on by statements made by people in the government. So you've had a minister in the government garlanding people who have lynched a Muslim to death and who are accused of lynching a Muslim to death. You have a Meghalaya governor, the governor of a state in India, continuously tweeting hate speech against Kashmiris, calling for the slaughter and rape and boycott of Kashmiris and Kashmiri trade and so on and so forth. The tweets still remain, by the way, so that's about Twitter, but it's also that the man still remains a governor. The government has not acted against him. You have any number of MLAs and members of parliament and members of assemblies and members of the cabinet of Mr. Modi who engage regularly in Islamophobic hate speech, regularly. And you have any number of Twitter handles followed by the Prime Minister himself, which are spewing violence against minorities, against women, against all critics of Mr. Modi.
Yeah. Okay, so let me go to Majid then. Majid, I wanted to get your thoughts on Kavita there just said, and I want to take a global view as well, Majid, because this is not, there's this sort of trend that we're seeing right now play out in India specifically. We're seeing play out globally in many places as well, aren't we? We're seeing this feeling of division and the other play out even in the Western world and in other parts of the world, Europe as well, etc. Why do you think that is? Why are so many parts of the world becoming so far right and so divisive within, do you think?
Well, I think the reasons for the different regions of the world are different. For instance, in the West, there is an increased rise of economic nationalism and end of plurality of the Western democracies. And then more of cultural nationalism within the American and the European societies, the advent of the white race, supremacy of the white race in the United States, for example. So there are different reasons within America, because the anger against the liberal economic project is constant. It's everywhere. It's in Europe. It's in the United States. So we see the rise of more economic nationalist policies, more protectionism, more trade wars erupting between the erstwhile allies. Okay. So the reasons are different, but the mainstay is that there was an established thought, be it economic or political or cultural, and that have not been able to gel in the societies. They have not been able to unify societies, and then people are looking towards more exclusionary, tendencies. And India is no exception to that global trend, as you rightly mentioned in your point.
Okay, so Kavita, let me come to you then and ask you, Kavita, what do you think are the root causes here? Is it simply political? Is it just the BJP, Prime Minister Modi and other officials, as you mentioned, just trying to win votes by hate mongering such in a way that Trump did, for example, in the United States at a certain level? Or is this also about the economy? Is this about something else, do you think?
No, I think that, of course, there are issues with the economy and all of that, even in America. But I feel that in America, just briefly to respond to what was said earlier, I don't think what Trump is doing is economic nationalism at all right? So he is harming even the cause of American workers. So you're actually having a very interesting rise of, the Democratic lists and so on also becoming popular, asking for more taxes on the rich and all of that. So that's a different situation. In India, I think, of course, partly Modi and the BJP were able to harness anger against neoliberal policies and against the previous corruption and corporate cronyism in the previous governments. But likewise, in India, Modi has proved to be the ultimate cronyist. He is directly implicated in corruption in a way in which the previous prime minister was not. All right. And I think so. They're of course trying to play to those anxieties, but above all, I think that the role of the media in India, and I need to call that out because I think that the corporate-controlled mainstream television media in India, 90% of it, maybe more, is completely. It has been a cheerleader for. It has built up the Modi brand. It has invested deeply in the divisive personality of Mr. Modi and the Sangh Parivar. It spreads all their narratives. It drowns out all other narratives. And I think of them, many of them now, as a fascist propaganda machine. So I do think of this as fascist politics at work primarily. I can't put it down to just, economic causes. The same economic reasons could have come up with a different solution as well. I just think that in this particular instance, their success has to do a lot with the kind of power they have commanded in the media as well. Yes.
But Kavita, to be fair, though, if we're talking about this world's largest democracy, just as a final thought, if I may put that to you, he does have quite a large base, doesn't he, of support, obviously, and I wonder then that in and of itself is also disturbing, is it not, that there are so many people going along with this sort of ideology?
Exactly. Always. I mean, that's the problem with fascism, right? That it's not a totalitarianism. It does manage to whip up the sentiments of a considerable section of society, and it tries to divide society, and it tries to play up on these hatreds and certain kinds of xenophobias and all of that. And that's what Modi is doing, and that's what the Sangh Parivar does. Yep. But I think that there are also other, they've been I just want to quickly bring this up, that there have been huge movements of peasants against this government, huge movements of students and youth speaking out against this government, women fighting against this government, the Dalit community on the streets against this government, and at the receiving end. We are all called anti-nationals for raising our voices in defense of India's constitution and democracy. So in a way, I don't know, I think that the other side also has a considerable base. Yes. And we do hope that in the coming elections, this government will be voted out.
All right, we're going to leave that as our final thoughts, but of course, we appreciate your times and insights, and of course, analysis. That was Kavita Krishnan, human rights activist, speaking to us from Delhi. She's also the secretary of the All India Progressive Women's Association. We were also joined by Mr. Majid Mehmood, a research associate at the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad, and of course, we appreciate him taking his time out of his busy schedule to speak to us as well. Viewers, we've spoken, of course, about this UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet warning India about how it treats its minorities, be it the Dalits, be it the Muslims, or other minority groups, such as Kavita said, the Christians or others as well. Warning, of course, that this not only hurts economic growth, but as Kavita there said, just hurts society. And of course, this is the second largest democracy in the world and likes to tout that whenever it can. But this is a disturbing trend, certainly very Trump-esque, if we may say. We'll keep a very close eye on how all of that develops there within India, in context, of course, of the fact that it is also picking a fight with Pakistan, or has tried to at least. Pakistan, of course, de-escalating that situation through its actions at this end towards peace. We'll keep a close eye, as I said, on that situation here in Scope. But I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.